Hello there, I'm Ty from ZDV Media. Today we're going to be taking a look at Camera Raw and the basics of Camera Raw. First, you have to select your image, which must be a RAW image. This can come in the format of ARW, CR2, or any other form of RAW image that comes from the set camera that you have. For example, Canon has the CR start, whereas Sony might have the ARW. Each camera brand has their own format of RAW, and you have to adjust your photos accordingly. Now, once you've taken your RAW image and you drop it into Photoshop, you can see this interface. With this interface, you can adjust and fix images that may look flat or too bright, too dark, anything under the sun that fixes your image. This is where most of your edits will end up being. Starting from the top, this bar up here is your histogram. This will show you which sections are way too overexposed. Basically, any of these spikes is where things are far too bright. So for example, you can see that the whites are very bright. So the white section on the far right needs to be adjusted. And you can actually adjust your different spikes in this area, but that's not what we'll be doing today. So from your base image, you can see that there are color profiles. These will help with setting a baseline for each of the photos you take. So you can see there's color, landscape, portrait, standard, vivid, and you can add more based on your Adobe Photoshop Creative Cloud. You can also browse profiles, and you can see the different baselines that you can apply. Next, you will see your white balance. The good thing about Camera Raw is you can change your white balance. So if you did not adjust your white balance when you were taking your photo, you can adjust it here. Now, tungsten lights are probably not the best idea, but it was a cloudy day, so you change it to cloudy. But we're going to keep it as shot. Below, you will see temperature. This is the same thing as your white balance. The far more right you go, the more warm the image will be. The far left you go, the bluer the image will be, or the cooler, I guess. It's good to know where on the scale each white balance number is. If you don't know it already, I suggest looking it up because it does help very much. Now, if you wanted to bring your temperature all the way to the right and make it very orange, it'll add a very gritty and almost ancient sort of look to it. But if you bring it to the far left and you make it blue, you'll almost make it more dramatic and more moody. But like I said, we'll be starting with a baseline where I took the photo. Tint is the very similar thing to temperature. However, it does not act the same. It is purple and green. So if your image is too purple or too green, you can adjust it accordingly. For example, this image is not green enough, so I add a little bit of green to it. Make it more natural. Add a more nature feel to it because there's more green. Now we get to the actual basics. Exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Whites and blacks are going to be your baseline, brightest whites and darkest blacks. And a fun trick you can use in order to get your brightest whites and darkest blacks is holding Shift and double clicking both the blacks and the whites. This will bring it to just as you're hitting the brightest whites or the darkest blacks. See, because I have such an overblown image or an overexposed image because the sun was behind the pillar, the brightest whites are going to be at -100. But we'll bring those back and we'll tackle these later. Now, exposure is like the brightness on your phone. It will affect everything in the image. So I don't typically start with exposure. Contrast adds more depth to an image. It darkens the lines and it adds, basically it unflattens the image. Whereas you can see here, it's very flat. If you want less contrast, you can make it almost look Polaroid because Polaroids kind of have that flat aspect without their flash. But if you want to add more contrast and you want to add more depth, you can make your image pop more. Highlights will affect the highlights of the image. It will affect where the light's hitting. It'll affect all of the light aspects of the image. So when you bring down the highlights, you can see that the sky is becoming more clear. That's because the highlights of the sky are being adjusted. Now, shadows will affect the darker parts of your image, not the blacks, but the dark parts. So if you lift your shadows, you can see the image is far more clear now because the darker parts of the image, aka the subject, were casted over shadow. So if you lift that, now the image is far more clear. The whites and blacks can now be adjusted in order to add a little bit more depth. I like to add just a little bit of black to my photos if it's not too dark already. That way it increases the contrast even more and adds more depth. Texture, clarity, and dehaze. They act similar, but different. Texture will adjust the details of the image. So if you have pictures of stone, when you increase the texture, the stone becomes more gritty and much more easy to see the actual texture of the stone. Whereas if you bring it all the way to the left, -100, everything becomes blurrier. Clarity acts similarly in the sense that it increases the clarity of an image. So if you have like reflection shots, if you have water, if you have reflections in water, if you have like window or glass, you can see when you increase the clarity that those images will become much more clear. Dehaze affects fog and it affects mist. It affects images that look misty and distant. So if you have a landscape shot where a mountain is way off in the background and you dehaze the image, you'll see that the fog, the mistiness of the image disappears. Now, once you change those images, once you change those sliders, you might have to go back up and adjust the sliders up above once more. If you have to do that, that's no problem. Coming down to vibrance and saturation, these will affect the colors of the image. Saturation is a much more drastic version of vibrance. You can see that all of the colors now look very blown out. Therefore, you don't want to add too much saturation. However, with vibrance, you can be a little bit more harsh. You don't want to be that harsh, but you can adjust it very slowly until you get to the nice colors that you want to have in your image. If they're too overblown and too in your face, then you want to bring back the vibrance and the saturation a little bit. I think that's good right there. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope this helps with your understanding of the basic section of Camera Raw.